Many scientists, including many scientists who personally believe in God, erroneously believe that methodological naturalism is the required assumption for doing science. In fact, the judge in the Dover case, who ruled against intelligent design being taught in schools, concluded that methodological naturalism is a ground rule of science today. Yet, contrary to what many people believe, methodological naturalism is certainly not a ground rule of science today. As Karl Popper clearly illustrated, the one ground rule in science that clearly demarcates whether a theory is scientific or not is whether the theory is falsifiable or not. In fact, Popper said, "I reject the naturalistic view. It is uncritical." And on the issue of being falsifiable, Darwinian evolution certainly does not qualify as being a valid scientific theory, since it has no clear criterion for falsification. Stanford professor Paul Ehrlich stated that the theory of evolution cannot be refuted by any possible observations and is thus outside empirical science. For anyone who has debated Darwinists on the internet, the fact that Darwinian evolution is not falsifiable should not be all that surprising. Any evidence presented to a Darwinist against Darwinian evolution being true is, for the most part, simply ignored or rationalized away by the Darwinist. As Dr. Cornelius Hunter noted, as far as the empirical science goes, being in evolution means there is no bad news. If a new species appears abruptly in the fossil record, that just means evolution operates in spurts. If species then persist for eons with little modification, that just means evolution takes long breaks. If clever mechanisms are discovered in biology, that just means evolution is smarter than we imagine. And he mentions more in the following quote. And the following video and paper show exactly why Darwinian evolution fails to qualify as a falsifiable scientific theory. Simply put, Darwinian evolution has no known law of nature to base its math on, so to establish itself as a testable and potentially falsifiable scientific theory. And whereas Darwinian evolution has no known law of nature to appeal to, so to establish itself as a testable and potentially falsifiable scientific theory, intelligent design does not suffer from such a disconnect from physical reality. In other words, intelligent design can appeal directly to the law of conservation of information in order to establish itself as a testable and potentially falsifiable scientific theory. As Drs. Dembski and Marx stated, laws of nature are universal in scope, hold with unfailing regularity, and receive support from a wide array of facts and observation. The law of conservation of information is such a law. In fact, all anyone would have to do to falsify intelligent design and potentially earn themselves $5 million in the process would be for them to demonstrate the origin of a single code by natural processes. In other words, the origin of a code that has demonstrably come into existence without a designer bringing that code into existence. Besides methodological naturalism ignoring falsifiability as the primary criterion for doing science, the main flaw with presupposing methodological naturalism as the supposed ground rule for all of science is that agent causality is ruled out of bounds as a legitimate scientific explanation right off the bat. As Dr. Paul Nelson noted, methodological naturalism entails an ontology in which minds are the consequence of physics, and thus can only be placeholders for a more detailed causal account in which physics is the only ultimate actor. Yet, ruling agent causality out of bounds as a legitimate explanation in science, as the following video shows, leads to the catastrophic epistemological failure for science. As Professor Nancy Piercy points out in the following article, even many leading atheists themselves admit that it is impossible for them to live as if their naturalistic worldview were actually true. And what should be needless to say, if it is impossible for you to live as if your worldview were actually true, then your worldview cannot possibly reflect reality as it really is, but your worldview must instead be based on a delusion. To put the catastrophic epistemological failure inherent to methodological naturalism even more clearly, either the design we see in life and the universe is real, or everything else that we hold as being real, such as our observations of reality, our sense of self, our free will, even reality itself, everything collapses into self-refuting, unrestrained flights of fantasy and imagination. In fact, because of such catastrophic epistemological failure that is inherent to the methodological naturalism worldview, it would be hard to fathom a worldview that is more antagonistic to modern science than Darwinian evolution and methodological naturalism in general have turned out to be. Moreover, whereas atheists have no clue how consciousness can possibly emerge from inanimate matter, as these following quotes make clear, on the other hand, the theist, as these following references make clear, can appeal directly to empirical evidence to support his belief that his mind is in fact real. As well, the theist, as the following video makes clear, can also appeal to recent findings in quantum biology to support his belief in a soul that is capable of living beyond the death of our material bodies. As to trying to provide actual scientific evidence for their belief that they have no free will but are just mindless automatons, many times atheists will often invoke the experiments of Benjamin Libet from 1983. Yet, Libet himself was a strong defender of free will. Moreover, despite the widespread false belief on the internet that Leibniz himself supported a deterministic brain, the experimental work of Leibniz has now been re-examined in finer experimental detail and found to support the reality of free will. Moreover, since agent causality is true and must therefore be gotten into the scheme somehow, the atheist ends up falsely attributing agent causality where it ought not be attributed. Specifically, the atheist ends up attributing agent causality to inanimate objects in both physics and in biology. Here are a few references that show that false attributing of agent causality in physics. And although falsely attributing agent causality where it ought not be attributed is bad in physics, this problem of falsely attributing agent causality where it ought not be attributed is particularly acute in biology. These following references make that point clear. But perhaps the most egregious violation of Darwinism, falsely attributing agent causality in biology where it ought not be attributed, is when Darwinists invoke natural selection itself as a creative agent in their just so stories to try to explain away the appearance of design that we see in biology. As Adam Sedgwick wrote to Charles Darwin himself, "You write of natural selection as if it were done consciously by the selecting agent." Even Stephen Jay Gould himself confessed that when Darwinists tell their just so stories, they inadvertently use natural selection as a causal agent. And the late Philip Scale noted that Darwinists will often use natural selection in their just so stories to try to explain completely opposite results with equal ease. Specifically, he stated, "Natural selection makes humans self-centered and aggressive, except when it makes them altruistic and peaceable. Or natural selection produces virile men who eagerly spread their seed, except when it produces men who are faithful protectors and providers. When an explanation is so supple that it can explain any behavior, it is difficult to test it experimentally, much less use it as a catalyst for scientific discovery." Yet, as the late William Provine rightly observed, natural selection is not a causal agent. Specifically, he stated, "Natural selection does not act on anything, nor does it select for or against, force, maximize, create, modify, shape, operate, drive, favor, maintain, push, or adjust. Natural selection does nothing. Having natural selection select is nifty because it excuses the necessity of talking about the actual causation of natural selection. Such talk was excusable for Charles Darwin, but inexcusable for evolutionists now." Moreover, before Darwin's theory of natural selection burst onto the scene, the default assumption by scientists of his day was that life was designed. As Francisco J. Ayala stated in his article entitled Design Without Designer, Darwin's theory of natural selection accounts for the design of organisms, and for their wondrous diversity as the result of natural processes. Darwin's focus in The Origin was the explanation of design. And Ernst Mayr, in his article entitled Darwin's Influence on Modern Thought, admitted much the same thing in 2009 when he stated, "Every aspect of the wonderful design so admired by the natural theologians could be explained by natural selection." And Richard Dawkins, in his book The Blind Watchmaker, repeated much the same thing and stated that, "Yet the living results of natural selection overwhelmingly impress us with the appearance of design, as if by a master watchmaker, impress us with the illusion of design and planning." Moreover, seeing that the quote-unquote appearance of design found in life that natural selection is supposed to explain is orders of magnitude more complex than anything man has ever designed or even imagined, such as the appearance of design that the human brain itself readily exhibits, and seeing that Darwinian evolution is unquestionably accepted by the vast majority of scientists in academia today, to the point of firing or ostracizing anyone who dares publicly question Darwinian evolution, then one might expect to find some fairly impressive evidence for natural selection producing such quote-unquote wonderful design. Yet anyone searching for such evidence, much less impressive evidence, for natural selection producing such wonderful design would be sorely disappointed in his search for such evidence. Charles Darwin himself had no evidence for natural selection, but instead cited tedious examples of artificial selection in domestic animals. Moreover, artificial selection, besides being accomplished by a causal agent instead of being accomplished naturally, as Darwinists presuppose, is known, as these following references show, to quickly run into insurmountable limits for any desired variation one might want within a species. To this day, Darwinists still have no evidence of natural selection producing any design whatsoever, much less wonderful design. All the textbook examples for Darwinian evolution, such as peppered moths, finch beaks, and antibiotic resistance, are found to be, to put it mildly, inadequate as evidence for natural selection producing any quote-unquote wonderful design. The impotency of natural selection was clearly illustrated in the following study on fruit flies, where, despite decades of sustained selection in relatively small sexually reproducing laboratory populations, selection did not lead to the fixation of newly arising, unconditionally advantageous alleles. The preceding finding really should not be all that surprising since, as the following video highlights, natural selection simply operates at the completely wrong level of the organism to be remotely effective as a supposed designer substitute. Simply put, natural selection operates at the whole organism level, yet to be effective as a supposed designer substitute, natural selection would have to operate at the nucleotide level of DNA. John Sanford terms this insurmountable dilemma for Darwinists as the princess and the pea paradox. Dr. John Sanford goes over the princess and the pea paradox in the following video at the 8:14 minute mark. The basic point of the princess and the pea paradox is that natural selection can only select for an entire organism and cannot select for individual nucleotides that are buried underneath the princess's mattress of 100 trillion cells, with each cell containing 3 billion base pairs of DNA. It is somewhat like a brain surgeon trying to do brain surgery with boxing gloves on. Or better yet, it is like trying to write a new computer program on computers by allowing random errors to enter the program and then throwing out every computer when its program crashed and only keeping those computers which have not yet crashed. Anyone who thinks that programming a computer can be accomplished in such a manner would rightly be thought to be insane. Yet, that is exactly what Darwinists are proposing, indeed insisting that we believe happened. As you can somewhat see from the preceding analogy, when selecting at the whole organism level, there is absolutely nothing that can be done to prevent slightly deleterious mutations from accumulating in computer programs or genomes that have not yet completely crashed. This intuitively obvious implication is borne out in numerical simulations, as you can see here. Moreover, to further highlight the impotency of natural selection as a supposed designer substitute, both microbes and multicellular creatures display an extreme stasis of form over long periods of time despite widely varying climates. This video touches on it, and as Dr. Donald Prothero states in the following article, in 4 of the biggest climatic vegetational events of the last 50 million years, the mammals and birds show no noticeable change in response to changing climates. No matter how many presentations I give where I show these data, no one, including myself, has a good explanation yet for such widespread stasis despite the obvious selective pressures of changing climate. In fact, besides there being no empirical evidence that natural selection can produce such quote-unquote wonderful design that we see in life, the math of population genetics itself falsifies natural selection. Here is an article by John Sanford that goes over that. And Ann Gauger and Doug Axe have also done work demonstrating the strict limits found for natural selection ever creating anything. And here is a good video that further drives home the point of what is termed the waiting time problem for natural selection. Many Darwinists who are familiar with the failings of natural selection within the mathematics of population genetics now champion what is termed neutral theory. The late Austin Hughes stated, Darwinism asserts that natural selection is the driving force of evolutionary change. It is the claim of the neutral theory, on the other hand, that the majority of evolutionary change is due to chance. Thus, with natural selection being tossed to the side by population genetics, as well as by empirical evidence, as the explanation for the wonderful design we see in life, Darwinists did not accept such a devastating finding as a falsification for their theory, but instead, Darwinists are now reduced to arguing that the quote-unquote wonderful design we see in life is basically the result of pure chance, with natural selection playing a very negligible role, if any role at all. Even Richard Dawkins himself finds the claim that chance alone can build such wonderful design to be absolutely inconceivable. In the following video, Dawkins states that the appearances of design cannot come about by chance. It's absolutely inconceivable that you could get anything as complicated or well designed as a modern bird or a human or a hedgehog coming about by chance. To put it even more bluntly than Richard Dawkins did, J. Homnick states, once you allow the intellect to consider that an elaborate organism with trillions of microscopic interactive components can be an accident, you have essentially lost your mind. Contrary to what proponents of neutral theory may want to believe, with natural selection out of the way as the supposed designer substitute for the appearance of design that we see in life, then the explanation for that appearance of design in life does not automatically revert or default to pure chance as the explanation for life. But the explanation for life instead reverts back to the original assumption that life is designed. This is because natural selection failed in its supposed role as a designer substitute. As Richard Sternberg states, Darwinism provided an explanation for the appearance of design and argued that there is no designer, or if you will, the designer is natural selection. If that's out of the way, if natural selection does not explain the evidence, then the flip side of that is, well, things appear designed because they are designed. Well, that's the end of the video. Thanks very much for watching, and again, I remind viewers that all papers and videos referenced in this video may be accessed in the link provided in the video description. Thanks again for watching.